The scripture reading, which will tell the story of the Apostle Paul, is Acts 26, verses 12 through 18. I, Paul, was traveling to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, when at midday along the road, Your Excellency, he was writing to the imperial authority, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my companions. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. I asked, who are you? And the voice answered, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you to serve and testify to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you. I will rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I'm sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of the accuser to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. And that's the end of the reading. So my message today, I'm going to dive right into the heart of it, is going to focus on that strange thing that Jesus said to Paul on the road to Damascus. After Paul fell to the ground and was blinded by the great light, Jesus said, Paul, why are you persecuting me? The Greek word for persecute could be translated, why are you trying to push me away? And then Jesus says, Paul, it hurts you to kick against the goads. What in the world is a goad? I had to look it up myself. Here's the definition. Goads were typically made from slender pieces of timber, blunt on one end and pointed on the other. Farmers use the pointed edge to urge a stubborn ox or mule into motion. Occasionally, the beast would kick at the goad, and the more it kicked, the more likely the goad would stab into the flesh of its leg, causing greater pain. The word goads in Greek is kentra. That's for the recording, for anybody out there who's keeping score at home. And is also translated as the word pricks, as in a pinprick, in the King James Version. Oh, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. I didn't even want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Except that the commentators went on to explain that in the Old English, that phrase was often used to describe someone who was stubborn, who was always rebelling against authority, and who often hurt themselves in the process. I have to admit, I have a tender spot for people who rebel against authority. Probably says a lot about me. But there are sometimes good reasons to push back against an authority. But that healthy reason or inclination can, once the ego gets a hold of it, morph into a kind of default setting of contempt or defiance that rather immaturely wants to say, you're not the boss of me. The problem is that sometimes someone is the boss of you. or there may be a higher authority or a higher power than one's little egocentric self. And sometimes we really do need to listen. It just might be the voice of God. And if we don't listen, we're going to get in our own way and hurt ourselves and prevent God's action from taking place, perhaps, or at least prolong it, and hurt other people too. Tom Petty once said, "I won't back down." There's a time for that. John Mellencamp said, "I fought the law and the law won." That happens too. Gospel music puts it, "Your arm is too short to box with God." A number of us grew up in the question authority, or really question everything era of the 60s and the 70s. As a friend of mine who's about 6 years older than I am often puts it, I grew up severely ADD, not attention deficit disorder, but authority defiance disorder. Many of us did, and often for good reasons. And I think God is glad for us to question things. If that weren't the case, then we wouldn't have, right smack in the middle of the Sermon of the Mount in Matthew 7, Jesus saying, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you'll find." But kicking against the goads, when Jesus said that to Paul, meant stubbornly refusing to be open to the possibility that God was someone or something other than what Paul had already decided. And that Paul was already invested in and committed to. Paul was completely convinced that his take on God and religion was right. And he wasn't going to compromise or back down. It was his way or the highway. And I'm pretty sure Paul was an Enneagram 8. He got his nickname eventually of the Great Lion of God. And God needed someone with bold, initiating, and challenging energy and commitment, and even with some sanctified stubbornness, to change the whole world, to change the whole thrust of what it meant to know and respond to God and live out God's love in human community. And God, in and through Jesus, and I've shared this many times with you, was radically reforming and clarifying the core message at the heart of the Jewish religion, just as God is now, in our time, radically clarifying and reforming the message at the heart of the Christian religion. But the problem is, that the church has made the same mistake as our Jewish ancestors did. And that's not an anti-Semitic statement. It's not an anti-church statement. It's just an observation of truth. We made God smaller than God actually is. We thought God had favorites. We thought some people were okay with God, acceptable to God, and some people weren't. Some people were worthy of taking communion, and some people aren't. And those of you who have been told you're not worthy to take it at another church, you know how much that hurts. So here's the point. Paul had to accept that God was actually completely different. Something other than what he had been taught and always thought. God was more loving than Paul had been taught. God was not first and foremost about religious rules. God was about love. God was not primarily about getting it right and doing it right. God was about grace and relationship and forgiveness. God was for everyone. Paul had to rediscover God. You know, there's a Buddhist saying that says, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Because the one you see is not the real one. Sometimes we have to let go of the God that we were taught in order to open ourselves to a fresh understanding of the God who actually is. And in order for that to happen, God had to literally knock Paul off his high horse. Or as author James Hollis puts it, Paul had to deal with his own hysterical certainty. Isn't that a great phrase? Hysterical certainty. James Hollis, he's a psychiatrist, Jungian psychoanalyst. He says that America right now suffers from way too much hysterical certainty. It's the presumption of rightness. Paul was way too sure he was right. Kicking against the goads is the spirit of opposition. The ego, an acronym for edging God out. According to a lot of the spiritual teachers I trust the most, loves to oppose. Be careful of oppositional energy. That doesn't mean not to think for yourself. It doesn't mean not to disagree. It doesn't mean not to take a stand for something, which sometimes includes saying a clear no to something else, injustice, exploitation. But it means stay open, stay curious, stay humble. Look for the presence and voice of God everywhere. Listen to deeply what others are saying and look for points of commonality and good-heartedness, especially in those with whom you disagree. So here's the main question for us today. Are there any ways in which we, even with the best of intentions, are somehow keeping God and God's intentions for us, for yourself, at a distance because we don't want to have to rethink something? Or let go of a certain opinion or way of seeing things that we're invested in. Especially something about God or the church or spirituality. There's an interesting conversation I find myself in a lot these days, more and more all the time. The details vary, but the basic conversation is something like this. People find out I'm a minister, and then they start telling me why they don't come to church, why they don't believe in God, why they don't believe in organized religion, why they have a problem with the G word. And we talk, and then they're surprised that I, for the most part, agree with their analysis. A lot of people have very good reasons for not believing in God, or at least the one that they were taught. And then if they're interested, they ask me, well, then how come you're still a Christian if you agree with me, and why are you, let alone a minister? And I say, well, because I believe that God is love and truth and grace and justice, and that that's what Jesus was all about, and that to me, it's just about opening one's heart and mind and soul to that and trying to embody that and live that out and then share that with others, and that when you do, a whole new world of love and hope and vitality and grace starts flowing freely in your life. You're in the stream of goodness, and that it's not about who's going to heaven or hell. That just trivializes the whole thing. Because the message of Jesus is way deeper than that. It's better than that. And usually at some point the person I'm talking with, and this sometimes takes a couple of years, but at some point they say, Bryan, you're starting to bug me. I don't know why that's funny, but all right. Because I've spent my entire adult life convinced that this God and church stuff is a bunch of baloney. And you're making me question what I thought was an airtight reason for rejecting God, or at least the church. And then sometimes a deeper truth comes to the surface. And we start talking about some of the deeper reasons, the more personal reasons why they could not and would not believe or be open to the possibility of God. So I'm going to close today by sharing one of these very personal conversations with you. You've heard me talk about my evangelical atheist stepfather. I would say evangelical because he wanted to convince the world this God and religion stuff was a bunch of nonsense. When I had my spiritual awakening at age 17, he and my mom had just recently married, and my mother was relieved because this brilliant atheist, he was a trial attorney, well-read, intellectually amazing. She was like, would you please talk him out of this nonsense? And believe me, he tried. And after about 10 years of realizing that this was not just a phase I was going through, and realizing that I also was pretty well read and not a fool, the tone of the conversation shifted, and it grew into this very affectionate 30-year sparring match where there was a lot of love and deep respect. The years passed, and he developed congestive heart failure. And at age 82, it was terminal, and he decided not to have any more treatment. So I flew down to Sarasota, Florida, where he and my mom lived several times, and talked through end-of-life stuff with them, from emotional stuff to pragmatic stuff. And the tone of the conversation started to shift. And he'd start to say things when it was just the two of us. You know, I don't feel real good about my life. Truth is, I've been a selfish jerk. And he would say things like, you know, I don't believe what you believe. You know how I feel about that. But I admire that your life is about something other than yourself. I regret that mine's not. As the end was approaching, my mother, who was 10 years younger than he, also developed congestive heart failure and emphysema. And she was hospitalized suddenly at one point. I flew down, went to the hospital, visited my mom, and then went to the house to spend the night with Guy. And he was not really able to care for himself at that point. So I made him a nice lasagna. And we sat down and had dinner together. And he said, you know, I really wish I could believe the way you do. And I said, well, you can, you know. It's not too late. And he said, no foxhole conversion for me. I got too much integrity. I'm not going to be a hypocrite, but I wish I could believe like you do. And then I said, you know, in my experience, people who are as committed as you have always been to not believing usually have a more personal reason for that. And he smiled and he said, you know, well, since you asked, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anybody. And he wouldn't mind me sharing this with you. He said, you know, I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina. Went to a Baptist church. My parents were holy rollers. My dad was a deacon at the church. Everybody thought my dad was a paragon of Christian virtuosity and righteousness. And the truth was, my dad was not a very kind man. One day we're driving home from church, and my younger brother and I, were fighting in the back seat like kids do. And my dad turned around and said, if you guys don't knock it off, I'm pulling this car over and you're walking home. And he was talking to Guy because Guy was older. They didn't knock it off. And his dad pulled the car over and pushed him out of the car. He was 8 years old. In the middle of nowhere, 10 miles from home. And he said, I went and sat by the side of the road. And I waited because I thought, sure, they'll come back and get me. And they never did. And I walked home 10 miles. And they never said a word about it when I got home after dark. And I promised myself from that day on, I would never believe in the God of my father. Then we had a really tender conversation. And among other things, I remember saying to him, well, the God I know walked you home that day. And God would never leave you by the roadside. And I'm so sorry that your dad did. But you've spent your whole life blaming God for that. Maybe it's time to let it go. And he smiled, and he didn't change his mind, but there was some light in the smile. And I said, look, I think you're going to be very pleasantly surprised when the time comes. God is love. You'll be welcomed home. We hugged. His last words to me, when we were talking about God as a judge or love, he quoted to me from memory, from childhood, judge not lest ye be judged, huh? I said, yeah, we hugged. He went into his bedroom. I was cleaning the dishes, and a few minutes later, the phone rings. It was a friend of his calling for him, so I called for him. He didn't answer. I went in the bedroom. He was gone. And my first thought was, oh my God, I hope my lasagna didn't kill him. I'm only half kidding. Are you kicking against the goads? Is it time to let go of whatever reason you think is good enough to keep God at a safe distance? It's only hurting you. I'll close with this little story, very little, from Anne Lamott's book, Traveling Mercies, since a bunch of you joined the church today. There was a little girl in the inner city, and she got lost one day in her neighborhood, didn't know where she was. And a policeman came and he found her. And he picked her up and he just said, hey, it's going to be all right. Let's walk around. And you tell me if you recognize anything. And all of a sudden she heard the church bells. And she looked, she said, go to that building. And it was her church. And they heard the organist practicing the hymns for Sunday morning. And she smiled and she said, you can go now. This is my church, and I can always find my way home from here. Well, that's enough for one day.